morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Trick Mirror. This is an essay collection by the cultural critic Gia Tolentino. She's been called the voice of generation, and after reading this, I've got to agree. It was written during a cultural inflection point, the WTF moment of Trump winning the presidency. And I actually read this during another inflection point, or collective WTF, as the pandemic hit and lockdown started. I was actually quite sick with COVID when I read it, so which was kind of the best and worst time to read it. You'll love this book if you both love and hate the internet. If you like essayists like Rebecca Solnit and Susan Sontag, and if you're still trying to get your head around what's going on in 2020. So at first glance, this looks like it's a book about sex, drugs, and the internet. It's not. It's about how each of these things, these sort of defining unofficial pillars of millennial culture, of internet culture, are features of our time in history and are actually not as superficial as they seem. Things that we might consider shallow, superficial, morally corrupt, like reality TV or the rise of the influencer, they actually provide a really useful way of looking at and thinking about the world that we live in. Like a trick mirror at a fun fair, each of these things reflects a distorted picture of the truth. We're so distracted that we miss an opportunity to use these things to examine the social, economic, and political climate in detail. So if you're willing to take the time to look beyond the surface, there are deeper truths to be discovered here, and even in the most infuriating and facile aspects of our culture. It's a book that will make you question everything that you think you know and demand that you kind of burn your beliefs to the ground. So the first thing that this book taught me was that the internet industrial complex is very real. The internet is so enmeshed in our lives that we often critically examine, we often don't take the time to critically examine what it's doing to us. We're dependent on it and we benefit from it in many ways, but because it provides us with so much, we often overlook the more insidious aspects of living such highly networked and connected, always on lives. You know, we have to be online now, but that means that we've agreed to always be on to maintain digital versions of ourselves to access the things that we need to get through our lives. Shopping, news, jobs, connections, social relations, yet it's actually nothing like real life. And because society is now structured around it, we've got no choice but to participate or lose out. So we've signed up to something without really understanding what we're giving in return. So by being online, we're also making people very, very rich. We, our digital selves, have become a commodity. We're the means of production. Our likes, our dislikes, our habits and peccadillos, our relationships, our data. So this essay asks us to consider what we're getting out of this connected life. Is it worth the price of admission? The internet is actually built around lots of things that are detrimental to us in many ways. It inflates our sense of self. It causes us to distort ourselves online and maintain that distortion. It makes us think about our opinions and that we value them more than anyone else's. It makes us feel really important. It pits us against one another. It flattens complex issues into binaries. It polarizes people by default because conflict is the driving force behind getting likes and clicks and shares. It makes us feel like we're doing enough to show up for one another, because solidarity is measured in clicks and performative posts. So we don't have to fully engage with subjects or empathize with others. Instead, we kind of insert ourselves into other people's struggles through our own posts and delude ourselves that we can relate and that we're actually doing enough to affect change. And the other thing that the internet does for us is that it distorts the scale of what truly matters in the world. The most important stories don't get the most views or the most traction online. Algorithms show people only what they're interested in seeing first. For example, you know, an Instagram celebrity revelation will get far more views, far more coverage than, you know, an ongoing famine in Yemen. And when you actually stop to think about that stuff, it's, you know, it's horrific. So I'll read you a quote from this essay. Gia Tolentino says that capitalism has no land left to cultivate but the self. Everything's being cannibalized, not just goods and labor, but personality and relationships and attention. I think, next slide. Okay, here we go. So the next lesson that Gia Tolentino teaches us in this book are that beauty ideals are just as toxic as they ever were. Back in 1990, Naomi Wolf wrote The Beauty Myth, examining the prison of beauty ideals that women are trapped inside in a culture that is basically structured around both capitalism and patriarchy. The premise being that as women grew more financially independent from men, a new locus of control emerged, and that was the beauty industry. As feminism has become more mainstream, we've kind of deluded ourselves into thinking that we've shaken off these trappings. We see greater diversity now compared to that baseline, though it's nowhere near a true reflection of reality. We've got a body positivity movement. We're prioritizing and empowering women, and that's become a mantra for kind of mainstream liberal feminism, the idea of choice and the illusion of choice. The truth is that, while it seems that we've made some progress, we're actually just talking about beauty in a different way, in a way that actually hides what's going on. We live in the age of an optimized self. So instead of doing beauty work, as Naomi Wolf called it, we practice self-care. Instead of diets, we go on cleanses and do clean eating. It's a reframing, not a liberation. So it's now not enough to sort of like overline your lips. You've got to have fillers. It's not enough to wear Spanx. You've got to adopt the relentless fitness regime so that you look like that all the time, so that you become your online self offline. Today, more than ever, women are encouraged to not only look a certain way, but to become the living embodiment of that ideal. How a woman looks can become her personal brand. And because it's a personal brand and a way of making money, it's become even more pernicious than it ever was. So as she says in this essay, we've got something much deeper burrowing now, not only a beauty myth, but a lifestyle myth, a paradigm where women can muster all the technology, all the money and politics available to her to actually become the idealized self. So the next essay is about how religious devotion is kind of like getting high. For some people, religious participation and drug taking might seem like opposite ends of a moral spectrum, where we're encouraged to think of it that way, with religion being the embodiment of purity and moral clarity, and drug taking being the embodiment of impurity and moral deviation. For anyone who's grown up with a religious background and has at some point segued into recreational drug taking, there are more than a few parallels here right for examination. Gia Tolentino grew up in a religious conservative Christian household, the sort of place where Disney movies were banned and she couldn't have a peace sign on her jotter, that sort of thing. She grew up attending a megachurch that she affectionately nicknamed the Repentagon, which I kind of love. When she was in high school, she started to have her doubts about religion, and by the time she was in college, as many people do, she experimented with drugs. And when she took ecstasy for the first time, she had this sort of revelation. It was at this point in her life that she realized that drugs, like religion, offered her an opportunity to transcend herself, that a spiritual high by an alternate means. Both religious ecstasy and chemical ecstasy allows her to experience something bigger than herself and to examine the world from a different perspective. So she complicates the idea of both religious participation and drug taking. Religious participation does have something beautiful and positive to offer, even to skeptics, but drug taking also offers something that makes everything feel like it was divinely intended and that they're not so different after all. Quote from this essay that I'd like to share is that she says that taking drugs can feel like divinity. It can make you feel healed and religious. It can make you feel dangerously wild. So what's the difference really? The next essay is one called The Story of a Generation in 7 Scams, where we're introduced to the unsettling notion that scams are not only everywhere, they're not only ubiquitous, that they're actually kind of laundering their reputation now. Scams are not just the preserve of con men. People knowingly engage in them as a means of accessing unprecedented wealth and power. Scams have become kind of so obvious and widespread that we barely react to them anymore. We know that Facebook's cashing in on our data. We know that Jeff Bezos has an obscene amount of money from his shopping monopoly. We know that the financial crisis was caused by handing out shonky loans to people that the banks knew couldn't afford them. And yet we still all use social media. We all still shop on Amazon. We all still rely on the banks. Donald Trump has ascended to the presidency not only by believing his own BS, but by duping the masses into believing it too, even when there's every conceivable bit of evidence to the contrary of what comes out of his mouth. The truth is that scamming pays today. People who try and rinse everything they can out of others are often rewarded with enormous wealth and unprecedented power. So not only has it become possible to do this, it's kind of become aspirational for some people, and that's the really scary thing. And she looks at the story of Billy McFarland, the guy behind the now infamous Fire Festival, who has just bounced from one scam to another. And we all know he's doing it, but he's made loads of money in the process. So the quote I'd like to share from this one is that the pipe dream is becoming the dominant structure of aspiration, and its end stage, shadows, cruelty, carelessness, nihilism are closely following behind. And the last lesson, one of many that this book taught me, is that feminist tropes and sort of internet feminism are harming the feminist cause. In the essay, The Cult of the Difficult Woman, she talks about the way that social media and internet feminism harm the global feminist cause. As it's become more mainstream, as feminism has become more mainstream, a deep examination through a feminist lens hasn't similarly become mainstream at the same time. An understanding of what feminism is can kind of be like really quickly gleaned from headlines and social media posts without any real meaningful engagement with the subject. So it's become commonplace now to refract feminist issues through the prism of celebrity, turning celebrities into quote unquote feminist icons merely for existing in a world where the odds are stacked against women generally. The bar for what qualifies as a feminist act now has become not what is radical, but what is simply being labelled as difficult for failing to conform in whatever sense that might be. Any criticism can be framed as sexist at the core if it's levelled against a woman. So any woman who's on the receiving end of it, ergo, becomes a feminist in the eyes of the media. The consequence of this is that the nasty women trope can kind of be control A, control like C, control V'd onto any woman, however undeserving of a feminist label she actually is. So you end up with a situation where Melania Trump gets praised in the New York Times for her quiet radicalism, or Theresa May gets hailed as a feminist icon for being prime minister, even though she backed cuts to social care, benefits, and policies that disproportionately harmed the lives of women. The internet is powered by memes, tropes, and standard content formats. And when we employ these without thinking about the consequences of that action, we dilute serious issues, we flatten them, and it becomes all too easy to label women as feminists just for existing in a sexist society. And because of that, our activism is in danger of becoming shallow and lazy. And so the quote I'll share from this one is that when a case for a woman's worth is built partly on the unfairness of what's levelled at her, things get slippery. So, conclusions. This is a quick and dirty overview of the Whip-Smart essay collection Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. It's one of those rare reads that you'll come back to again and again. It's one that in my Kindle app, like I feel like almost every second line is highlighted and that I've referred to again and again. This is a handful, this is 5 takeaways from a book that will just continually make you think. It's brilliant, it's challenging, and perhaps most importantly, it really sort of tries to encourage you not to dismiss things that you would otherwise consider trivial, and that you can use them as a way to examine yourself and examine the world around you more deeply. If you enjoyed this, you can find me on all the usual platforms, including Goodreads. I read a lot of books, and usually on Instagram, I do a story every month kind of recapping what I've read in miniature. I really hope that you do read this book. It's wonderful. It's one that I have bought for many other people and will continue to do so. Thank you so much for listening.